Control does not always arrive with a voice raised in command or a hand clenched in violence. Sometimes it seeps in like air through a cracked window, unnoticed until it fills the entire room. The most terrifying form of dominance is the one that asks for nothing and says nothing, because it forces you to bend without ever being told to bow. You learn quickly that silence is not empty. It is heavy, deliberate, suffocating. When someone controls you without words, they do not need to argue, explain, or persuade. They simply stand in their silence, and you, in your uncertainty, begin to police yourself. The mind cannot tolerate voids. When an answer is withheld, the imagination rushes to fill it, and more often than not, it fills it with fear. You replay every glance, every pause, every unfinished gesture, and you build a prison out of your own interpretations. This is the invisible chain, forged not of iron but of thought, one link at a time, until you wake up realizing that you have shackled yourself in anticipation of a punishment that never needed to be spoken. What makes this grip so powerful is that it does not announce itself. There is no rebellion against words that were never said, no defiance against orders that never arrived. There is only the growing awareness that your silence, your hesitation, your self-restraint have been orchestrated by another who does nothing but wait. You become the warden of your own behavior, not because someone demanded obedience, but because their quiet presence left no room for disobedience. This is how control begins, not with noise, but with absence, not with chains you can see, but with chains you imagine, chains you accept, chains you never thought to resist because they were never placed on you by force. They were whispered into your own mind by the void that silence left behind. The most unsettling truth about invisible chains is that they rarely feel like chains at all. They arrive disguised as pauses, as withheld responses, as the quiet refusal to acknowledge your need for clarity. In those moments of silence, the weight of another's power grows louder than any spoken command. You begin to lean forward, searching their expression, their body language, the slightest shift in their presence, desperate to decode the meaning behind what they have not said. This is how silence becomes an unspoken order. You adjust your tone, soften your words, censor your emotions, not because they instructed you to, but because the silence itself demanded it. The absence of affirmation is enough to make you doubt your every move. You start to wonder if you disappointed them, if you stepped out of line, if the lack of response is punishment in disguise. In this way, control without words is often more suffocating than direct authority, because it forces you into a labyrinth of self-doubt with no map and no exit. Every possibility of failure lives inside the silence, and so you live carefully, cautiously, molding yourself to avoid mistakes that were never named. The one who controls you never needs to break their quiet, because they have already entered your mind, and your mind is now their enforcer. You anticipate their disapproval before it arrives. You silence yourself before they silence you, and you surrender freedom in exchange for the illusion of peace. This is the true cruelty of invisible chains. They convince you that you are acting out of choice, when in truth you are reacting to a silence so sharp it cuts deeper than any spoken threat. What appears to be restraint on their part is in fact the most calculated form of domination, one that rewrites your behavior until you no longer distinguish between your will and theirs. The quiet becomes law, and you, afraid of breaking it, willingly kneel. What makes the grip of invisible chains so devastating is not the noise of authority, but the quiet that replaces it. You find yourself reshaping your thoughts, your gestures, even your breath, not because anyone openly demanded your obedience, but because the silence itself pressed against you like an unseen weight. In that silence, every glance becomes a warning, every pause becomes a judgment, and every unspoken word feels sharper than steel. You begin to understand that control does not always need commands. Sometimes it is more effective when it hides behind withheld approval and unbroken stillness. You lean into the silence, searching for signs, desperate to decode what they want without them ever needing to voice it. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, you stop living by your own rhythm and begin living in anticipation of theirs. What you fear is not punishment, but the unknown, the dark void that silence leaves behind, a void your mind rushes to fill with imagined consequences. That is the true terror, the way silence turns you into your own judge, your own guard, your own jailer. They do not need to chain you because you have already bound yourself with the fear of what might come if you step too far outside the invisible boundaries. It is here that the chains dig deepest, because they are not tied to your wrists or ankles, but woven through your decisions, your hesitations, your very sense of self. You obey not out of loyalty or respect, but out of the dread of breaking rules that were never spoken but always implied. And once you reach that stage, where silence dictates your every move, you begin to realize that the most unshakable prison is not built of stone or iron, but of shadows, pauses, and quiet spaces that leave you questioning every choice. The chains are invisible, yes, but they are also unbreakable, because they exist inside you. There are moments when words are unnecessary, when the weight of someone's presence speaks louder than any command they could give. You feel it in the room before they even open their mouth. The way conversations shift, the way people adjust their posture, the way laughter dies down or grows more cautious. Power, at its purest, is not carried in declarations but in the silence that follows a gaze, a pause, or a stillness that forces everyone else to recalibrate. The person who masters presence does not need to threaten or explain, because their very existence in that space alters the behavior of those around them. This is a deeper form of control, the kind that operates without noise, without spectacle, without argument. It is a pressure you cannot name but cannot escape, a silent choreography where everyone learns their steps without being taught. You begin to notice how you change in their company. You speak softer, you choose your words more carefully, you even rehearse your thoughts before voicing them. Their presence alone becomes a mirror reflecting your insecurity, your desire for approval, your fear of misstep. And this mirror does not lie. It shows you how easily you bend without being touched, how quickly you surrender your voice when someone else's silence carries the weight of judgment. This is the essence of control through presence, the ability to occupy space so completely that others reshape themselves around you. It is not a prison built of chains or threats, but of subtle gravitational pull, a force that keeps you orbiting in their gravity without ever realizing you have stopped moving freely. And the most haunting part is this: you cannot fight what was never spoken. You cannot argue with silence. You can only respond, adjust, comply, until their unspoken dominance feels natural, until it feels like the air itself, a constant, invisible pressure that shapes you in ways you no longer question. The silent weight of presence is more than just being seen. It is the subtle domination of space without a single syllable. You notice it when someone enters a room, and the atmosphere changes before they have done anything at all. The shift is not in words, but in the air itself, as though everyone instinctively recognizes that an unspoken authority has arrived. Their silence is not passive but charged, filled with unarticulated expectation. Every movement, every hesitation from you, becomes magnified beneath the gaze of someone who does not need to speak to make their meaning known. You feel the demand without hearing it. You sense the boundaries without being told, and you find yourself conforming to rules that were never written down. This is the paradox of presence. It feels intangible, yet it grips you harder than chains of command ever could. When someone wields silence like a weapon, you learn quickly that noise is unnecessary. Their power is not in explaining but in withholding, not in insisting but in simply existing in a way that makes you bend. You adapt. You edit your sentences mid-breath. You shrink or inflate, depending on the tilt of their head or the stillness in their eyes. And over time, this quiet choreography becomes second nature. You no longer wait for instruction. You anticipate it in their posture, in their pauses, in the way they choose not to answer. You are caught in a system of control where words are redundant because your imagination does the work for them, painting rules into silence, transforming their stillness into a language you obey without question. This is the deeper truth. Presence itself is a silent script, and you, desperate for approval or terrified of rejection, learn to read it fluently until your actions are no longer your own. Presence becomes most dangerous when it is mistaken for silence without intent. What appears to be calm restraint is, in truth, a calculated strategy, a way of bending the will of others without appearing to lift a hand. You begin to sense that every pause, every withheld glance, every delayed response is not emptiness but design, a quiet architecture shaping the room and everyone in it. The silence becomes the stage, and you are compelled to perform upon it, uncertain of the script yet terrified of improvising the wrong line. Their stillness forces you to second-guess your choices, to replay your words before they even leave your mouth, to adjust yourself not once but again and again until you are molded into what you believe they want. And here lies the secret. They have spoken nothing, promised nothing, demanded nothing, yet you act as though their judgment were thunder in the air. The truth is that control through presence is far more enduring than shouted orders, because you cannot resist what was never explicitly declared. There is no target for rebellion, no sentence to attack, only the pressure of an atmosphere that leaves you restless, uncertain, compliant. It is the unspoken contract of human psychology. We fear silence more than words, because silence is infinite, and into that infinity we pour our own doubts, our own insecurities, our own chains. Their presence becomes the container for your fear, and you willingly step inside. This is how dominance endures without confrontation, how power operates unseen, not in the noise of authority, but in the quiet certainty that your very existence is being measured against a standard no one dares articulate. You are ruled not by laws but by pauses, not by orders but by an aura, and in surrendering to it you find yourself obeying commands that never needed to be spoken at all. The most potent form of control does not come from the words we hear, but from the spaces left between them. When silence replaces clarity, the human mind does not rest. It races, it invents, it fills the void with possibilities, and more often than not, those possibilities are terrifying. This is why unspoken threats linger longer than shouted ones. because the unknown is always more frightening than the known. When someone with power chooses not to answer, not to explain, not to confirm or deny, they plant a seed of fear inside you that grows wild in every direction. You imagine punishments harsher than reality. You anticipate rejection sharper than any real dismissal. You feel consequences hanging over you that may never arrive. And because of this, you begin to act cautiously, carefully, shrinking yourself to avoid stepping into the undefined territory where their silence seems to hold danger. This fear in the gaps becomes the true leash. Not the words spoken, but the words withheld. You obey not to avoid what they promised, but to protect yourself from what you imagine. And in many ways, this is a deeper prison, because you can argue with an order, you can resist a command, but how do you fight against the dark possibilities that silence leaves behind? The answer is that you cannot. You can only mold yourself to avoid them, policing your own every step, whispering caution into your own thoughts. Their silence echoes louder than their voice ever could, and you mistake your own imagination for their authority. Thus, you surrender, not to what is real, but to what is possible. And in surrendering, you prove that their control is complete, because they no longer need to act at all. The gaps they leave are enough to chain you tighter than any spoken rule. Fear is never stronger than when it hides in silence, because silence has no shape, no boundary, no edge where it can be measured. The mind cannot endure a blank space. It rushes to complete it, and in doing so, it often paints the darkest picture possible. When someone with authority deliberately leaves a gap, a hesitation, a pause where explanation should be, they weaponize this natural instinct. You begin to imagine what you cannot see, to invent punishments harsher than any reality, to assume that every choice you make might awaken consequences you will not survive. Their silence becomes an open canvas, and you supply the terror. You replay conversations late into the night, searching for hidden meanings in what was left unsaid, convincing yourself that every unfinished sentence carries a threat, every unanswered question conceals judgment. In this way, your own imagination becomes the cruelest enforcer of all, because you build prisons around yourself with the very thoughts they never had to voice. This is the essence of fear in the gaps. They do not need to speak, because you will do the speaking for them, filling every pause with dread. And that dread governs you more effectively than any shouted rule, because it is not limited to one command. It stretches into every corner of your life. You hesitate before acting, before speaking, before even thinking freely, because you know that within every silence lies the possibility of disapproval or punishment. And that possibility is endless, infinite, unresolvable. You cannot rebel against it, because it does not exist in the world, it exists in you. Their silence plants the seed, but it is your own mind that grows the roots, your own fear that waters them, until the gaps between words bind you more tightly than chains of iron ever could. The grip of silence is strongest when you realize that the fear it breeds does not stay confined to one moment, but spreads into every part of your life. You begin to notice yourself hesitating even when they are not present, second-guessing choices no one has questioned, softening your words for ears that are not listening. This is the true genius of unspoken control. It colonizes your imagination. Every pause they left behind becomes a living echo inside you, a reminder that stepping beyond invisible lines could trigger unseen consequences. And the cruel irony is that you will never know where those lines truly are, because they were never drawn in the first place. You invent them, redraw them, expand them until your world becomes smaller and smaller, a shrinking circle defined not by their words, but by your fear of what their silence might conceal. You censor yourself not once, but constantly, rehearsing your life as though under perpetual trial. The punishment never arrives, yet the dread of it is enough to make you live as if it has already been delivered. And in this way, they win without lifting a finger. You are the one who keeps yourself small, who avoids risks, who silences your own thoughts before anyone else can. Their power lies not in rules, but in the absence of rules, because absence leaves room for endless possibilities, and the human mind, when faced with endless possibilities, leans toward the darkest one. This is how silence becomes law, how the gaps become cages, how the unspoken grows heavier than anything declared. It is not the chains on your wrists that hold you down, but the weight of what you fear could happen if you dared to test the quiet. And so you remain bound, not by their command, but by your own imagination, which has been turned against you like a blade. There comes a moment when silence no longer feels like absence, but like a reflection of yourself, a mirror held up by another in which you see not who you are, but who you fear you must become. Control takes root in this reflection, because when no words are spoken, you begin to hear your own voice echoing back as theirs. You anticipate what they want, you predict what they would approve of, and slowly you learn to act before they ever need to speak. It is as though their silence installs itself in your mind, a quiet presence that whispers not commands but expectations. And these expectations grow sharper with time, because you are the one who sharpens them. You imagine the look they would give, the disapproval they might feel, the disappointment that would hang in the air if you failed to meet their invisible standard. And so you bend. You speak softer, you cut away pieces of yourself, you adjust your very identity to fit into the silent outline of what you believe they demand. What is terrifying about this mirror is that it does not reveal reality. It reflects fear. It shows you a distorted version of yourself, not as you are, but as you must become in order to avoid the crushing silence of their withheld approval. Every choice becomes rehearsed, every gesture pre-approved by an inner voice that is not truly yours anymore. You cannot tell where you end and they begin, because their absence of words has grown louder than your presence of thought. You have become an actor in a play that exists only in your mind, yet directed by someone who has never spoken their lines aloud. And the longer you perform for this imagined audience, the more you forget that you were ever free to move differently. Their silence becomes your script, and you follow it faithfully, believing it to be your own. What makes this mirror so dangerous is that it is not held in their hands, but in yours. They need only remain silent long enough for you to begin crafting your own reflection, and once you start, you cannot stop. Every time you hesitate before speaking, every time you soften your expression to avoid tension, every time you replay what you said wondering if it was acceptable, you are polishing that mirror with your own fear. The silence does not instruct you. It invites you to instruct yourself, to become both the actor and the critic, both the prisoner and the guard. Soon, you find yourself obeying not because of what they said, but because of what you believe they would have said. Their power thrives not in action, but in the expectation you carry inside you, an expectation you created yet attribute to them. This is how the reflection deepens. Your mind rehearses their reactions. Your heart bends beneath the imagined weight of their judgment. and you make choices not out of freedom but out of preemptive surrender. The terrifying truth is that they no longer need to exist in the room for you to obey them. You carry their silence within you like a ghost that never leaves. And the ghost becomes louder than the living presence ever was. You begin to confuse their imagined disappointment with reality, their supposed anger with truth, their silent absence with constant surveillance. This is why the mirror is more destructive than chains. Chains remind you of your captor, but the mirror convinces you that your captor is yourself. You see them everywhere because you have built them into your own reflection. And once that reflection hardens, it becomes nearly impossible to remember who you were before you started bending toward the shape you thought they wanted. In this way, silence becomes not merely control, but identity theft. It replaces your voice with theirs without a single word needing to be spoken. The cruelest part of this mirror is not that it shows you what they want, but that it convinces you that what you see is what you want. Over time, you begin to confuse compliance with choice, obedience with virtue, silence with peace. You look at yourself reflected in their unspoken demands and tell yourself this is maturity, this is wisdom, this is the price of love, respect, or belonging. Yet somewhere beneath the polished surface of that reflection, a quieter truth trembles. You are no longer living for yourself, but for an image projected into you. They have no need to threaten or correct, because the reflection has already colonized your mind. You shrink before their imagined eyes. You rehearse your words as if you stand on trial. You measure your smallest actions against the weight of invisible judgment. And the more you submit to this reflection, the less you resemble the person you once were. You may even praise them for their restraint, their calmness, their supposed fairness, not realizing that their greatest act of control was to never lift a finger while you did all the work for them. It is here that silence becomes the most efficient of weapons, for it shapes you without resistance, leaving you unable to separate where they end and where you begin. You wake one day to find that the reflection in the mirror no longer feels foreign. It has become you. And yet, beneath that image, there is a faint ache, a memory of your real face, the one that once looked back with freedom. That face is still there, buried under the reflection imposed upon you, waiting for the moment you stop mistaking expectation for truth. But until that moment comes, you remain trapped in the echo of their presence, carrying within you a prison whose bars are invisible, whose locks are imaginary, yet whose hold is unbreakable until you learn to look away. There are many kinds of silence, but none as punishing as the silence that arrives when connection is withdrawn. It is not simply the absence of sound, but the deliberate withholding of presence, of warmth, of acknowledgement. In this withdrawal, there are no raised voices, no arguments, no obvious cruelty. Instead, there is an emptiness that gnaws at the mind more deeply than words ever could. When someone who once offered recognition suddenly turns away, when their gaze becomes cold, when their responses vanish into air, the human spirit panics. We are wired to seek belonging, to survive in the web of human bonds, so the absence of that bond feels like death in miniature. It forces you to question every action, to scour your memory for offenses, to twist yourself into new shapes in hopes of regaining what was taken. This is not discipline, nor is it indifference. It is strategy. For silence wielded in this way becomes an instrument sharper than any command. By retreating, they create a void that you rush to fill, giving more of yourself than you ever intended. The less they give, the more you scramble to prove your worth, and the balance of power tips without a single word exchanged. In time, you learn to fear the quiet more than conflict itself, because conflict at least provides sound, shape, and certainty. Withdrawal gives you nothing but shadows, and in that nothingness, you are compelled to create your own chains. What makes this grip so potent is that it masquerades as absence, as though they are doing nothing at all, when in reality, the act of stepping away is the very mechanism of control. It is the art of making you beg for what should have been freely shared, leaving you dependent on the return of what they have withheld. Withdrawal thrives on the fear of emptiness, and the silence it brings is never neutral. It becomes a mirror reflecting your deepest insecurities, convincing you that you are the cause of their absence, that something inside you has driven them away. The more they step back, the more you lean forward, desperate to bridge the void, until every gesture you make is less about genuine connection and more about appeasement. This quiet punishment rewrites your behavior without their having to instruct you directly. You start speaking more carefully, watching your words like they are weapons that might explode, censoring your emotions so they never trigger abandonment again. Slowly, you build an internal system of self-surveillance, where you police your own desires, your own truth, your own instincts, for fear that revealing too much might invite the chilling silence once more. And in this self-censorship lies the elegance of the control, because you no longer need their direct pressure. You do their work for them. The grip tightens not through confrontation, but through the absence of it, as if their withdrawal creates an invisible leash you cannot stop tugging against. You mistake their silence for authority, their absence for superiority, their coldness for strength. And the tragedy is that each time they withhold themselves, you become more convinced that regaining their presence is worth more than holding onto your own dignity. You trade pieces of yourself for scraps of recognition, until one day you realize the recognition has become rarer, the scraps fewer, and the emptiness inside you more vast. It is then you understand that the shadow of withdrawal was never accidental. It was crafted to make you cling harder, give more, and diminish yourself in the desperate hope that they will one day turn their face toward you again. The most haunting quality of withdrawal is that it teaches you to beg for silence to end, even when you no longer remember what peace feels like. You find yourself bargaining not for happiness, not for love, not for fairness, but simply for the return of presence, the sound of their voice, the acknowledgement of your existence, the faint warmth of attention that reassures you are still seen. That hunger becomes its own prison, and in that prison, you will compromise boundaries you once swore to defend, abandon truths you once held sacred, and endure degradations you once thought impossible. Each pause, each cold glance, each calculated absence drives you deeper into the illusion that they hold the key to your worth. But the truth is more sinister. The grip works precisely because they have convinced you to forget that your worth existed long before their recognition. The withdrawal is not a void. It is a construction, an architecture of absence designed to bend your will. They do not need to raise their hand, or sharpen their voice, or force a command, because you willingly reshape yourself in the darkness they leave behind. You walk into the cage believing it will lead you back into their light. And yet, what you are really entering is a cycle that has no end, because every concession feeds the silence. Every surrender deepens the shadow, and every sacrifice convinces them their power is absolute. This is why withdrawal is not passive. It is the most deliberate form of domination, because it lets you destroy yourself in the hope of being rebuilt by them. The silent grip does not squeeze with force. It waits with patience, knowing that the emptiness will corrode you from within until you are nothing but a reflection of their absence, clinging to the faint hope that one day they might choose to return. The final stage of their influence is not when you resist them, nor even when you obey them, but when you begin to police yourself so effectively that their presence is no longer necessary. This is where the grip achieves its quiet perfection. At first, their silences, their withdrawals, their unspoken expectations weigh upon you like external chains. You feel the burden as something outside of yourself, something you long to shake off. But gradually, you internalize those chains until you no longer need their hand to bind you. You wake up already calculating your steps, your words, your gestures, rehearsing them against an imagined tribunal that exists only in your mind. Their shadow becomes your script, and you follow it without question. You silence your laughter before it grows too loud. You soften your anger before it reaches your eyes. You bury your questions before they escape your tongue. The warden is no longer standing over you. The warden is within you. And this self-imposed surveillance is the most insidious form of control because it feels like choice. You tell yourself you are wise for holding back, mature for restraining yourself, disciplined for avoiding conflict. Yet beneath these rationalizations lies the deeper truth. You are no longer free. You are simply efficient at serving your own cage. The paradox is that the more you practice this restraint, the less you notice it, until it becomes your second nature, your quiet routine, your way of being. And by the time you recognize what has happened, you may find that your voice has grown faint, your will has grown soft, and your sense of self has been reduced to a faint echo of what once was. To become your own warden is to become complicit in your own confinement. And that is the ultimate triumph of control, when the prison moves inside you, and you cannot tell the difference between obedience and identity. What makes this transformation so dangerous is that it feels invisible. You do not notice the moment when their rules stop being theirs and start becoming yours. In the beginning, you bite your tongue because you fear their silence, their withdrawal, their disappointment. Later, you bite your tongue simply because that is what you do. No command is necessary, no glare, no punishment. Your instinct does the work for them. You monitor your emotions, trimming them down before anyone else can. You edit your words until they are stripped of their sharpness, their honesty, their fire. You learn to anticipate rejection before it comes, so you never risk stepping outside the boundaries they once imposed. At some point, you even begin to congratulate yourself for this vigilance. You call it wisdom, self-control, balance. You convince yourself you are being strategic, that you are choosing peace, when in reality you are only choosing the walls you have been trained to carry within. And the cruel irony is that the grip is now stronger than ever, because they no longer need to tighten it. You do it yourself. You have become both prisoner and guard, both captive and enforcer. This is why escape feels almost impossible. Who do you fight when the voice of the oppressor has blended so seamlessly with your own? You cannot rebel against yourself without tearing apart the very structure you believe is holding you together. And so you cling to the comfort of your cage, telling yourself it keeps you safe from the chaos outside, when in truth, the chaos you fear most is the rediscovery of who you were before the cage was built. To become your own warden is to carry their power long after they are gone. To live as though their gaze is still upon you, even when the room is empty. The deepest cruelty of becoming your own warden is that it convinces you to protect the very walls that hold you in. You tell yourself these walls are safety, that they shield you from rejection, conflict, or pain. But what they really do is suffocate the parts of you that once reached toward life with fire and honesty. You stop speaking your truth because you no longer trust your voice. You stop pursuing your desires because you fear they might be judged. You stop standing tall because you believe invisibility is safer than exposure. And slowly, you disappear, not because someone erased you, but because you erased yourself in service of the rules you carried within. This is the final perfection of silent control, when you forget that it was ever imposed and believe instead that it was your own choice. You mistake surrender for discipline, caution for wisdom, restraint for virtue. You celebrate yourself for fitting neatly into the cage without realizing that every celebration is a mourning in disguise. The prison has been moved inside, and you wear its keys like ornaments, proud of how well you guard the emptiness. Yet somewhere, beneath the rehearsed silences and the polished obedience, a faint memory resists. A memory of laughter that was once unrestrained, of anger that was once righteous, of words that once cut through fear like light in a darkened room. That memory is your last tether to freedom, though it feels fragile, nearly extinguished. To break the grip, you must do the unthinkable, betray the warden you have become. You must disobey the rules you once internalized, even if your own mind screams that it is wrong. Because only in that rebellion, against the voice inside that is not truly yours, can you begin to reclaim the face, the will, and the life that was buried beneath the silence.